As Parliament returns, debates are intensifying over how to keep the community safe. On immigration detention, the government's worried the High Court will continue to redraw the lines on who it can hold and for how long, while the opposition is risking the ire of young social media users pushing for a potential ban on TikTok. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The opposition is pursuing the government on a range of national security issues right now, but one will be of particular interest to millions of young social media users: a potential ban on TikTok. The US is debating what to do about this hugely popular platform owned by Chinese company ByteDance. Critics have two main concerns: users' data being hoovered up and the spread of misinformation. But about half the American population is on TikTok. It's how millions of young people interact, access news and do business. It's become the latest flashpoint in the strategic contest between the US and China, and the latest point of national security disagreement in Australia. For now, the Prime Minister says he has no plans for a TikTok block.
If you're one of those people who has a cell phone or is on the internet, you might be interested in the big news from Congress.
The House of Representatives is set to vote on a bill that would force TikTok to divest itself of its Chinese ownership or be banned in the United States.
The yeas are 352, the nays are 65. The rules are suspended, the bill is passed.
The fate of every tween-age TikTokers in the hands of a bunch of old white people with Hotmail accounts. This is a big deal. This is like iPhone Footloose. Let's dance! And there's no Kevin Bacon to save us.
Our intention is for TikTok to continue to operate, but not under the control of the Chinese Communist Party.
But TikTok is fighting back. Their CEO told users to call their representatives. Young people are like, first we're losing TikTok, now we have to make a phone call? What is going on?
Keep TikTok! Keep TikTok!
We got 5 million small businesses to save.
And I'm here because I talk about books on TikTok, and I encourage people to read, and I want to keep on doing that.
If I had any concerns about China, I would have the same concerns about right here in America sharing and selling our data too.
I have been keeping up with...
This bill gives more power to a handful of other social media companies.
This kind of bullying behaviour is used when one can no longer win in fair competition.
Oh, you're a good man.
But a decision early next year would thrust TikTok into our election.
We have made decisions based upon our own security assessments.
They should have already sent drafting instructions to the Department of Home Affairs to get them to prepare equivalent legislation for Australia.
The algorithms that these programs use, I think, do have an injuring effect on kids, but in terms of national security, we'll take the advice of the national security experts.
If he's got advice from the agencies, which I believe he has, it's up to the Prime Minister of our country to respond in the appropriate way.
We're independent. We don't follow other countries. Thank you.
And my guest this morning is the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson. First, let's check what's making news. Game on, says the Sunday Mail in Queensland, after huge swings against the Labor state government in 2 by-elections yesterday. The close of counting last night, an 18% swing had the LNP on track to pick up the seat of Ipswich West. An even bigger swing of 22% was recorded in Inala, although Labor looks set to hold on to that seat. It's a brutal blow to Premier Stephen Miles ahead of October's state election. And the news wasn't much better for Labor in the Brisbane City Council election yesterday either. Anthony Green called it for the LNP 2 hours into the count. Adrian Schrinner will remain Lord Mayor. Labor's vote dropped, while the Greens gained a swing of 6%. Meanwhile, in South Australia, the Sunday Mail reports Liberals are sniping after yesterday's Senate pre-selection battle. Frontbencher Anne Ruston has been pushed down to the number 2 spot on the Liberal ticket, while Conservative rival Alex Antic has taken the top spot. And finally, on the High Court, News Corp reports the government is bracing for a decision next month that could see more than 100 foreign criminals released into the community. The case involves 2 people who are apparently refusing to engage with efforts to deport them, while the 9 papers highlight a case involving an Iranian man who's refusing to return to Iran, where he fears persecution because of his sexuality. Now, we'll get to the TikTok debate shortly, but we're going to start with immigration detention because the government is preparing the ground for more of these difficult High Court rulings in the months ahead and more opposition attacks when Parliament resumes tomorrow. Labor insists it's doing all it can here, tightly monitoring those who've been released, painstakingly preparing cases to re-detain high-risk offenders and hiring dozens of lawyers to wargame where the High Court could go next. It's also going to step up transparency around how many are being released and how they're being monitored. This is all called getting on the front foot on a difficult political issue. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Samantha Maiden, Phil Curry and Dan Borscher. Welcome to you all. Let's start on this High Court issue, Sam. The government makes the point it reckons the game has changed, the landscape has changed. The High Court has left us since November in unsettled territory. Mentioned a couple of the cases that it's worried about that are coming up. The High Court basically said you can't indefinitely detain someone. You can't keep someone who has no prospect of being resettled in the foreseeable future. But it is unclear what no prospect of resettlement means or what the foreseeable future. This will be defined in coming cases, won't it?
Yeah, look, I think that the clear danger for the government is that if it is established that all you have to do is not say anything, what has been described in some reportage as the refuseniks, that will just, really open up the gates of hell.
People who won't answer questions.
Everyone will be doing it, right? And this is where I think we do enter into the theatre of the absurd. Look, at the end of the day, I think that there is a common sense to the idea that you can't detain people indefinitely. And sooner or later, once that got to the High Court, it was pretty clear where that was going to go. But they have to find a way of grappling with this issue of, now we have people popping up on Facebook touting for people saying, if you're gay, come see this migration lawyer. We might be able to get you, your visa sorted. I think that it is, a very tricky issue for the government to
Well, it might have some common sense to it, but it's the High Court, Phil, that will ultimately and does ultimately interpret the Constitution. And it is ruling, not just in this ruling in November, but in a series of rulings, that governments, parliaments, the executive can't sentence someone. Only judges can have judicial power.
Yeah, and that was the basis of the finding last year. But now we're seeing consequences spring from that decision. Other people now challenging their detention on other grounds. Look, the danger of this, David, it's sort of, for most people, it's fairly impenetrable legalistically.
It's not impenetrable once one of these people gets let out and there's a problem.
No, but I mean in terms of following the reasoning and whatever else. Most people just see this sort of chaos. And the government of the day tends to wear that chaos, and that was why they did this briefing on Friday and sort of try to, warn us that this might happen again next month, based on these 2 pending cases, one of which is an Iranian guy refusing to go home. The thing is, the Iranians refusing to go home has always been a thing. The Iranian government doesn't take Iranians who left the country seeking asylum elsewhere. If you remember, Julie Bishop, when she was foreign minister, went to Tehran, sort of trying to beg them to take them back when it was a problem for that government. But ultimately, the government of the day is the one that sort of is in charge and needs to look in control or out of control. And we saw how sort of dangerous it was for the Albanese government at the end of last year when they, it wasn't their fault. The High Court made the decision, but they sort of wear the consequences.
Well, then they scrambled to put in place these preventative detention laws.
They don't seem to be very active.
Well, no, and so basically they're taking their time before bringing the first case forward to apply to have someone locked up under these laws. Apparently 35,000 documents for one case are required to go through their entire life history. It seems extraordinary, but they're worried that, of course, the High Court could knock out these preventative detention laws if they get it wrong.
Get something wrong, that's right. And don't they have to be like, they're state courts, I think Supreme Court decisions, I think, when they're breaches of state law, where they breach their visa conditions or whatever. So it's not a quick process.
Well, anyway, you can expect the opposition to pursue that further this week. We'll hear more from James Paterson about that in a moment.
And of course, you can't legislate around this either, because it's
exactly. You have to go to a referendum if you want to change the constitution here and redefine what government can do.
This is the argument.
They're not going to do that.
Interesting to see, what James Paterson has to say in the interview. This is the argument around this idea that the government in the past, allegedly, would occasionally release people rather than have a test case that went all the way. And there has been...
And that happened a number of times under the former government, right? To stop a High Court ruling, let someone go so that you avoid that possibility. But
because
with
once
this case,
you have the precedent in case, all hell breaks loose, as we've now seen. And so that's the big question, and it'd be really interesting, you know, to see the government really pushed on this issue and to see, you know, Andrew Giles sort of asked this question, is it the case that he just found it too unpalatable to release this individual?
He's a child sex offender.
Exactly, right. And so...
What do you do? I mean, I guess it's a bit of hindsight now. We can have that argument as to whether it would have made a difference, but you can see the conundrum there, right?
Yeah, I still, when I was saying that it's common sense about indefinite detention in relation to people that have not been convicted of a crime, right, in relation to this detention issue, yeah, like I still think that sooner or later this was going to find its way to the High Court.
Yeah, because there aren't many parts of the world where you can indefinitely detain someone
without
in an immigration setting
charge,
without a charge. Yeah. TikTok, Dan, let's get into this. This is a fascinating. It brings in strategic issues, free speech issues, you name it. But perhaps we should explain to those, and I'll put my hand up here. I'm not a big TikTok user. This may
you'd probably be pretty popular on the platform.
I don't know.
I love it.
Tell us about TikTok. And how it sort of evolved from the dancing videos, as I understand it, to now being a business platform, a news platform. What is TikTok?
Well, it's short form videos in short, and people talking about things that are important to them and finding this incredible market. I mean, in the US alone, I think 170 million people.
Like half the country.
It's quite extraordinary. And we heard this week when the House of Representatives passed that the law saying basically TikTok has to be divested from ByteDance, the Chinese-owned company. Not saying that they'll be banned, but they need to be owned by someone else. Otherwise, there will be bans that follow from that. But I think what's been so popular is that the lack of filter, and that it is a way of people connecting directly with an audience that is hungry for this type of content. Of course,
but that's like social media generally. It's that direct interaction. I guess, is this more fun?
Well, I think the algorithms are much stronger. So when you're on there, it understands the things that you like and then keeps giving you that. So then that's why it's become so addictive, and people are spending such extraordinary amounts of time on the platform. The other side of that, of course, is that when it is a primary news source for so many people, there are no rules around what is said. We understand that some of those algorithms actually make it put content that is anti-China or critical further down the list or anything. Right. So there are all these kind of issues, let alone the security risks that have been raised around how data is harvested.
Sam,
I have gone very deep down the TikTok hole, initially I think as a way to surveil what the hell my children were looking at, and then found that
journalistic reasons too,
and then found that it's hugely addictive because once I found out that you can get a lot of cooking recipes like high-protein vegan meals, blending up your silken tofu. Too much information.
Okay.
But the thing that's really fascinating to me about it and scary is that it's completely addictive. So I think that it absolutely probably is a kind of soft diplomacy thing of China to basically rot our brains in Western culture, because is everybody on TikTok in China? I'm not sure they are to the same extent. And it does serve up the same content. So if you get, like, for example, young boys watching Andrew Tate, it serves up more and more Andrew Tate. There's huge amounts of misinformation. And once you get into the misinformation, it serves up more misinformation.
But again, you can get misinformation on Facebook, on Twitter, you name it. But is the issue, I know that's one of the main concerns here, but the other one is clearly the Chinese ownership.
Sure, for sure. But I think that the difficulty in the most simplest terms is like, look, you can take the vapes off the kids. I'm not sure if you can take the vapes and the TikTok. Even though, I think that you probably should. It is kind of fascinating, I think, what China is doing, because Chinese government is involved in the vape situation as well. And they are the two things that are destroying teen. Well, no, but it's true. It is, if you talk to the parents of children, it's two of the biggest issues that will freak them out, vapes and TikTok. Yeah.
I think one of the...
Because it makes kids zombies. They just sit there looking all day.
Well,
and that's just their...
Well, so the original concern with TikTok was data harvesting, and we had a briefing few years ago now, I remember from some of the spooks about it. And they weren't too worried about TikTok back then. I'd be interested to hear what Senator Paterson thinks, because he's obviously more plugged into this side of things. But I remember the actual words they used a few years ago was it was basically a garden variety data harvester, so they weren't that worried about it. You know, there was more, they were concerned about far more things than TikTok. Right. But now, since then, we've seen governments ban the use of it. You know, government employees aren't allowed to use it on their work devices and phones, and we see this ban, as Dan was mentioning, in the US, and we're clearly under some pressure from our allies on this. And the Prime Minister's he got asked about it again yesterday, and you can sense his deep reluctance to go there for those reasons that will annoy the hell out of a lot of people.
Well, just to illustrate that point, I mean, in the US, the politics of this are fascinating, right? So the vote in the House of Representatives the other day was overwhelming, and you don't see agreement like this very often in the US political climate.
352 to 65.
It was amazing, and it was led by the likes of Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher.
TikTok is a threat to our national security because it is owned by ByteDance, which does the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party. We know this because ByteDance leadership says so, and because Chinese law requires it. This bill therefore forces TikTok to break up with the Chinese Communist Party.
So you had a Republican leading the charge there, but the guy the Republicans want to put back in the White House, Donald Trump, he's flipped on this. As president, he was calling for a ban. Now he's not.
Frankly, there are a lot of people on TikTok that love it. There are a lot of young kids on TikTok who will go crazy without it. There are a lot of users. There's, a lot of good, and there's a lot of bad with TikTok. But the thing I don't like is that without TikTok, you can make Facebook bigger. And I consider Facebook to be an enemy of the people, along with a lot of the media.
Along with a lot of the media.
All right, well, if he likes TikTok, I think we should ban it. I've changed my mind.
He does not like Mark Zuckerberg, I think is the point.
No one likes Mark Zuckerberg.
But he's also got an eye on those hundreds of millions of young TikTok users.
But it's such a fantastic vehicle for misinformation. And so for that reason, Donald Trump would love it.
And this is one of the things about the lack of regulation, isn't it? Is that we can all be on TikTok and we would have no visibility of what anyone else is seeing, because it feeds off how it understands what we are and our psychological makeup. So you're going to see more stuff about perhaps blended tofu and,
no, I'm joking.
And kale.
This is kale. I'm never going to live this down now.
There'll be a TikTok video of you talking about
tofu.
It'll become very meta, and then everyone will be talking about their reactions. But there's the regulation hasn't kept up to be able to monitor and to stamp out misinformation, which is where the risk to democracy has been talked about in terms of the way that people's views can be aligned when you're talking about Tate, for example.
All right, well, time to talk to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson, about this. He has been raising concerns about TikTok, in fact, for years. The platform itself is pushing back at the moves to force its sale. In fact, it's launched an all-out effort to defend itself, urging TikTok users to contact members of Congress and let them know they want the platform to stay. Here in Australia, as mentioned, the Prime Minister, well, he says millions of Australians engage on this platform.
You've got to think very carefully, in my view, before you start banning things as a first stop. We'll always take security advice, which is what we have done. The security advice isn't to ban TikTok. It is to make sure that, where appropriate, that there be some restrictions, and the government has put that on ourselves.
Senator James Paterson, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David.
So the Prime Minister there says the security advice is not to ban TikTok. Should that advice be followed?
Well, I have good news for the Prime Minister and Donald Trump, which is that the plan is not to ban TikTok. The plan is to make TikTok safe by removing the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And the threat of the ban is just the enforcement mechanism to make sure that TikTok complies with the law. The end that I hope for is that Australians can continue to use TikTok, but just without the risk that their data is abused and without the risk that the Chinese Communist Party can put its thumb on the algorithm to pump disinformation into our democracy.
But do you really think China's going to say, oh, OK, we'll sell it because America's told us to?
Well, it's a really interesting question for ByteDance. If they're acting like a rational commercial company, they should embrace this opportunity. Some independent assessments have said that TikTok is worth up to $160 billion US. And if the choice is accept a payday of $160 billion or stand by and allow your app to be banned and lose that value, then that would be a very irrational choice. But it would be quite an illustrative choice, because I suspect ByteDance would operate as it is, an extension of the Chinese government, not as a commercial entity, and that would be revealing.
Just in terms of the Australian Australian context here, you heard what the Prime Minister said there about the advice they're getting, the security advice. He said Peter Dutton's been saying he believes the government has advice from intelligence agencies about TikTok and needs to respond to that in the appropriate way. Can you tell us what advice is Peter Dutton pointing to there?
Well, David, I've been extensively briefed by our intelligence community on the danger of TikTok, which it obviously wouldn't be appropriate for me to go into detail with, but let's just point to some things that are in the open source arena.
But should Peter Dutton be pointing to that?
Well, let me take you to that, David. Number one, TikTok was exposed for using their app to spy on journalists to identify their sources, and they lied about it. Number two, independent researchers have found on sensitive topics to the Chinese government, like Xinjiang, there is far more pro-Chinese government propaganda on the platform than any other comparable platform. And on issues sensitive and divisive in the West, like Israel and Gaza, there's far more pro-Hamas content than any other platform. And when this was pointed out, how did TikTok respond? They shut down the research tool that allowed these independent researchers to make those points and to identify that. So TikTok is a bad faith actor. It is a risk to our democracy. It's a risk to our national security. And the government should take action here to protect Australians from this very serious threat.
But are intelligence agencies here telling the government to do something that it's refusing to do?
Well, it was on the advice of intelligence agencies that the government banned TikTok from government devices. And I think that is very illustrative. It's not safe to be on the phone of a bureaucrat. Why should 8 million Australians have it on their devices without any protection at all?
Is the government ignoring advice from its agencies?
Well, it'd be very rare for intelligence agencies to recommend a policy solution. That's not really how they work. That's not their space. What they say is, these are the threats and these are the options to mitigate it. So the Prime Minister's being a bit cute when he says the intelligence agencies haven't recommended we ban it. Well, first of all, no one's recommending we ban it. We're just recommending you remove Chinese Communist Party influence.
But they are putting that as an option. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, you'd have to ask them. That's for them to talk about. That's not for me to talk about. But I'd be very surprised. In fact, I know for a fact the intelligence agencies are not saying to the Prime Minister, there's nothing to worry about with TikTok. There's no concerns at all. We know that's not the case.
So there's two main concerns that you're pointing to there. Just go to the first one, which is data harvesting, or your data being hoovered up. What do you think China is doing with that data?
Well, they can use it for espionage against individual people, and they can also use it at scale to build a very sophisticated picture of our society, and that's a very important asset for them to have in a digital age. You know, when ASIO assesses that foreign interference and espionage are our #1 security threat, and we know that much of that is cyber-enabled, having TikTok on the devices of almost half Australians, almost half Americans, is a very serious national security threat.
TikTok says for Australian users, the data is held in Singapore, Malaysia, the United States, not in China.
Correct, and they've also acknowledged, including to me in a Senate hearing, that regardless of whether that data is stored, it can be accessed and is accessed by their engineers in China who work for ByteDance. And why that's important, David, is that those people are subject to the 2017 National Intelligence Law of China, and Article 7 of that law requires that all Chinese citizens and companies assist the work of Chinese intelligence agencies and keep that cooperation secret. So they could be handing over that data to the Chinese intelligence community without even ByteDance or TikTok knowing, and certainly without any Australians knowing.
And then your other concern is about the spread of misinformation. That can happen on any platform though, can't it? Do you need something wider than just targeting TikTok if that's the concern?
It absolutely does happen on all platforms, and this is quite an important point, David. Facebook regularly publicly assesses that there are attempted Chinese foreign interference attempts on their platform. They disclose that, they block it and they remove it. TikTok has never once found, in its own view, a Chinese foreign interference attempt on their platform. Now that's pretty curious, David. If the Chinese government is using Western headquartered social media platforms for disinformation, why would they not use the platform located in their own jurisdiction who they can directly control?
And the other big question a lot of people ask in this debate is, if you did get to a ban, how do you ban TikTok? You can't go around taking it off everyone's phone. So what would a ban actually involve?
We're looking at that right now, David. We're seeking advice on that. But actually, there's lots of legislative options available here. And one of the precedents in our country is the Huawei decision. It is possible to ban high-risk vendors from our country. We do have extensive legislative options. I hope that the Minister for Home Affairs is looking at this right now. In fact, she has a bipartisan report from the Senate Select Committee on foreign interference through social media, which made 17 recommendations, one of which was, if the United States successfully removes TikTok from ByteDance, Australia should seek to do the same.
But
so really the clock is ticking.
Back to the, pardon the pun, back to the question on practically how you ban it. I mean, Huawei, that's hardware. You can ban the sale of, physical phones. But with an app, you can't take it off people's phones. You might be able to stop them updating the latest version of the app down the track, but they can keep what they've got, can't they?
No, there's actually extensive legislative options here, David, in the Telecommunications Act, in the Critical Infrastructure Act. That is the least of my concerns. The biggest concern I have is the will to act here. I'm worried that the Albanese government is going to be weak on this, as they have been on so many other national security issues.
And what about WeChat? You've previously said this poses almost exactly the same espionage and data security risk that TikTok does. I mean, would you want that banned? Where do you draw the line? Is it whack-a-mole after a while with these things?
Well, David, I'm not advocating a ban to TikTok and I'm not advocating a ban to WeChat. What I'm advocating is removing the Chinese Communist Party control over all of these apps. And among the 17 recommendations, among the 17 recommendations that the Senate Select Committee on Foreign Interference through Social Media made was that we need to impose tough transparency obligations on these platforms. One of those is that they need to be transparent about the relationship they have with foreign governments and about the direction that they receive from foreign governments to interfere with content on the platform. They need to be transparent about what happens to the data and who can access it. Now, those recommendations are there for the government to implement at any time. They can pick those recommendations up. I really hope they do so.
Just before we leave TikTok, I've got to ask you this. If it is as dangerous and a national security risk as you mentioned, why does the Liberal Party have an official account on TikTok? I mean, we can see here some of your colleagues posting TikTok videos over the years. The latest post from the Liberal Party's account was on Friday, so they're pretty regular posts. Should the Liberal Party be on TikTok?
David, all Australian political parties and politicians are active on the platform. I think that's okay as long as they follow the government's national security advice about mitigating those risks. For example, it should not be on the same device that they have their work or personal information on. It should be on a standalone device.
Don't they need to set an example here, though? If it's a national security risk, why are they on it?
Well, David, that's actually not going to help Australians. There's 8.5 million Australians on this app. The only thing that can help Australians to protect them from that is not personal abstinence. It's actually the government taking action to protect them, and they can do that by passing laws. It's available to them right now, and they should do so.
So the party will keep using it until it's no longer allowed to?
Yeah, well, they don't need to ban it. They don't need to ban it for anyone, including the Liberal Party. It can be safe to use, but only once that relationship between ByteDance, the Chinese Communist Party, and the app is severed.
But you don't get on there?
No, I'm not personally a TikTok user.
Okay, I didn't think so. Let's move on. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is going to be in Canberra this coming week. Do you reckon this issue should be raised with him?
Actually, David, this is not a high priority issue to raise with the Chinese government. They are not going to fix this problem for us. Only we can fix it for themselves. And the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister have a long list of issues to raise with them, in particular and most importantly, the death sentence facing the Australian citizen Yang Hengjun, the action that was taken against against Australian divers, Navy divers on the HMAS Toowoomba, where they were harmed by Chinese sonar. Those are the high priority issues to be raised.
And I want to ask you about the immigration detention issue. The government, as we were talking about earlier, is trying to, it says, stay ahead of the curve here. Further cases coming before the High Court, continuing to draw boundaries around who it can hold in immigration detention for how long. What do you think the government should be doing in preparation for some of these cases?
Well, Friday's briefing to the media was a desperate attempt to lower expectations further about the government's ability to respond to this, and with good reason. They've shown shocking incompetence every step of the way. The first thing they should do, David, is make an application to the court under the preventive detention regime that the Parliament passed 4 months ago to take just one of the 7 murderers, just one of the 37 sex offenders, just one of the other people convicted of violent crimes off the streets to protect the community. Because right now those people are out there in the community and they are reoffending against the community. 18 of them have breached state or federal law and face charges. 10 of them have breached their visa conditions, but unfortunately every one of those 10 is going to walk free because Andrew Giles completely stuffed up issuing their visas.
Well, you're talking there about taking a case to preventatively detain one of those who's already been released. It wants to be sure, the government says, that it's got a watertight case. That's why it's taking some time. If it failed at the first hurdle and the High Court ruled the preventative detention regime's no good, where would that leave them?
Sure, David, but it was only this week that the government announced that they put some extra lawyers on the case. Why didn't they do that 4 months ago?
Okay.
And if the government says that this bar is too high, that it's too difficult to apply, well, we've sat as a parliament for 2 weeks already. We're about to sit for another 2 weeks. Introduce amendments to lower the bar to make it easier to apply. I'm very confident that we would assist with swift passage so that these laws can actually be used. The government says their hands are tied.
Wouldn't lowering the bar to make it easier to lock people up create a greater risk? The High Court says that's no good, that's unconstitutional.
Well, David, we have a risk right now, which is that offenders, foreign offenders, are in the community re-offending against Australians. There are people who are now victims who should never have been victims because these people should not have been released into the community, and once they were, they should have been taken off the streets.
So back to the original question, though, the further cases that are coming, the concern that could make it harder to hold even more people in immigration detention. After the event, no doubt the opposition would be critical of the government. So right now, what would you say the government needs to be doing?
Two things, David. Number one, they should not make concessions of fact like they did in the first case. Andrew Giles admitted that there was no reasonable prospect of NZYQ being deported, and the High Court said that was highly significant in their decision. I hope they don't make mistakes like that again. Secondly, they should be prepared. They should have the legislative options ready to go. They should have them ready to introduce into the Parliament the day after the court hands down its decision.
What should they have up their sleeve?
Well, last time we told them that they needed to have a preventive detention regime. Yeah. They spent 3 weeks saying that they couldn't do it until they finally admitted, actually, maybe we should, and then they did it.
So what do they need now?
Those are the kind of things. Well, David, it depends on the individual cases, right? But the Department of Home Affairs should be doing contingency planning here.
But this is the question. Is there anything you think the government should be doing right now to protect the community?
Well, it's a fair question, David, because we have led the government all this way and they've relied on our advice clearly to do this.
What's your advice now?
My advice last time was have a preventive detention regime. My advice this time is go to the Department of Home Affairs and ask them, what are the contingencies? If this happens, what should we do?
So just ask the department what their ideas are.
Well, it's clear that didn't happen last time, David.
You don't have any new ideas?
David, I think I've provided enough for the government already. I've been pretty generous in that, and I hope they can find some of their own.
Australia's now joined Canada and Sweden in restoring funding to UNRWA, the UN relief agency in Gaza. The European Union's restored most of its funding. The Foreign Minister says the advice of Australia's various agencies is that taxpayer funds won't end up in the hands of terrorists. Do you disagree?
The Foreign Minister also said the advice was that UNRWA is not a terrorist organisation. David, that's not exactly a high bar. I think we should have higher expectations of our aid delivery partners than merely they are not terrorist organisations. What we do know is UNRWA has employed terrorists. UNRWA employees were involved in the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October. An UNRWA social worker drove into Israel and abducted a dead Israeli back into Gaza. That was the
allegation. An investigation is still underway.
No,
Staff
David,
have been dismissed.
That's not an allegation, that's evidence. The footage is available on the internet for anyone to see. UNRWA has sacked the people involved. There's no contention that there were UNRWA employees involved on the 7th of October. The question is what we now do about it. My view is that we should not tolerate a single Australian dollar going to a potential terrorist. I mean, this is not the only accusations against UNRWA. It's been exposed that there was a Hamas data centre underneath UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza that was drawing mains power from UNRWA. UNRWA has admitted in the past that their textbooks in UNRWA schools in Gaza have had anti-Semitic content that promotes hatred against the Jewish people. I mean, Israel has been warning us for years about the behaviour of UNRWA. Those warnings were ignored, and the consequences were UNRWA employees participating in the worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust.
But kids are starving in Gaza. You were just there. You made the point that aid is desperately needed, that it's a critical need for that food to get in to the kids in Gaza. Are you saying, though, that giving UNRWA money now is still going to see money end up in the hands of terrorists?
I have no confidence that UNRWA has reformed itself, particularly because our closest allies, like the United States and the United Kingdom, have not restarted their aid. And the obligation, David, is absolutely we must do everything we can to assist the people of Gaza, but without running the risk that our aid money goes to terrorist organisations.
So what's the solution here? How do you stop kids starving?
That means we have to explore every other alternative. That includes the airdrops that are happening. That includes the delivery by sea. The first delivery by sea happened overnight, David, by a United Arab Emirates delivery, working with another charity, World Central Kitchen. I mean, we had been hearing in the lead up to this that there's no one other than UNRWA capable of delivering aid. That is clearly not true. The United States is also exploring alternative options like sea delivery. There are other charity partners operating in the region. We should do everything we can in the safest way we can to make sure that the listed terrorist organisation of Hamas doesn't end up with Australian taxpayer funds.
A final question related to this. The government has revoked visas of some of those it issued visas to trying to flee Gaza. Penny Wong has said that they're all subject to ongoing security checks. What does this tell you? You were worried about adequate security checks. Do you accept they are happening?
Well, maybe they're now happening, David, but several months ago we raised these questions and the government attacked us and said we were smearing them and politicising national security. It turns out we were right to ask these questions. They were granting visas to people that their own security advice now says they shouldn't, and no wonder, because they were rushing them through so quickly. I mean, some of these visas were approved in 24 hours. The ABC has reported there was a visa granted in a single hour. It is just not possible to do adequate identity, let alone security checks, on people coming from a war zone run by a terrorist organisation in that short amount of time, and it's hardly surprising that we've now had to cancel visas that were issued while these people were in the air. But frankly, the government should apologise, because they assured us all the necessary checks were done, they were thorough, and there was nothing to be concerned about. Well, clearly that was not true.
Senator James Paterson, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Coming up, big changes on the way to aged care funding, more user pays. We're going to get into that. First, let's continue this conversation. Back to our panel. Samantha Maiden, Phil Curry and Dan Borscher. Look, just on the UNRWA funding decision, the US is yet to restore its funding, but a few others have. Now Australia, Sam, has made this decision too. Clearly, it's very concerned about what's happening on the ground in Gaza. Do you think, or can you explain why now, why it's made the decision to put the money back in now?
Well, the way that Penny Wong described it is she said, I don't know what I don't know, but I do know that people in Gaza are starving. That's basically been her starting point. And, you know, like, I think the government is concerned about the infiltration of this organisation by people with links to Hamas. And I think that James Paterson is correct, those videos do exist, and there have been people that the Israeli government have named that were involved. There have been people that were fired. And obviously Australia has gone ahead out in front of the US, but they're concerned that there's no other way to distribute aid in Gaza.
Of course, these things, Phil, are discussed with Washington. My understanding is that, yes, there have been conversations about it. While the US hasn't gone there yet, they're comfortable with Australia, Canada and so on doing this.
Yeah, I don't discount domestic political pressure too on the Albanese government's been significant, you know, from the left. So to reverse that decision, I think the takeout from all this is UNRWA has become completely compromised by this, and what may be the most efficient aid vehicle at the moment. Clearly, it's not going to be. That's not how it's going to be. You suspect it's just lost the confidence of, you know, a large part of the Western world because of what happened. So, you know, as per Sam's point, yes, people are starving. Yes, it has to be done, but I don't think it's a long-term, however that mess lands. You know, when they finally stop fighting.
Yeah. Well, here was the Foreign Minister's comments about having confidence, at least, that the money won't end up in the hands of terrorists.
The best available current advice from agencies and the Australian government lawyers is that UNRWA is not a terrorist organisation, and that existing and additional safeguards sufficiently protect Australian taxpayer funding.
Yeah, Dan, as James Paterson said, I don't think anyone suggested that UNRWA is a terrorist organisation. The question's always been whether it has elements that are too close to Hamas or were involved, in fact, in those October 7 attacks. What do you think? I mean, there has been pressure, as Phil says, on the government when it comes to this issue domestically.
Yeah, and I think, as you pointed out, there's an investigation underway about who in UNRWA knew what or was involved in what capacity. I think that there has been substantial political pressure here in Australia and around the world. The question that we're still not talking about, though, is that in spite of whether it's UNRWA or someone else, how are we going to be getting aid when there are millions of people crammed into these tiny areas? And the references there were, of course, to the sea routes, but that's not the most effective or efficient way. It's by land. So that's actually the conversation we have to have, is how do we get the right support to those people who are caught up in this, who are the collateral in this.
And then you've got this issue around the people fleeing Gaza who were given visas by Australia, then had them revoked while they were in either Egypt or Turkey. In fact, one of those in Turkey now stuck because they don't have a visa to stay in Turkey, can't go back to Gaza, can't come here to Australia. One of them spoke to News Breakfast.
Suddenly I got the news of my visa got cancelled, and I didn't know what to do. And my family told me that I should book a flight and get back to Cairo. My family all told me that I should get as soon as possible to Cairo. And when I booked the flight, they told me that I don't have a visa to Cairo, and I don't have a visa to enter Turkey even.
So I don't know what they do, but what's happened here? Is it clear why the visas were stripped?
I assume some national security concern, but it's not clear, no. And it should be clear because...
Yeah, there's been suggestions, Penny Wong, when asked, said, you know, there are ongoing security checks. Didn't want to get into individual
should have told them before they left.
There's a suggestion there's uncertainty about how these individuals actually left Gaza.
How they got out of Gaza.
Yeah, everyone's tightly monitored when they go through the Rafah crossing, but they're not sure how these particular people ended up in Turkey or Egypt. But will there have to be more clarity on that in the coming days, do you think, Sam?
Well, you think so? I mean, look, if you were in Gaza, you'd get out anyway you could, wouldn't you? I mean, that's
not easy.
It's not very orderly.
Reality. But I just think it's very messy to have people kind of trapped, and I would have thought it leaves Australia open on some way to, you know, legal claims. I mean, like if these people are essentially rendered unable to return, and they're kind of stateless on some level, yeah.
Let's turn to aged care. Look, firstly, a big pay rise Friday afternoon from the Fair Work Commission for aged care workers. What is it, up to 28%? That includes the 15% last year that was awarded. But look, this should help attract the much-needed staff they need in aged care. But Phil, is the government going to foot the bill?
Well, they might have to. It's expensive. I mean, the one last year, the 15% interim pay rise cost $14 billion. And that was 11.3 billion plus another 2 and a bit once you put in super contributions and everything else. It's a great pay rise if you're in aged care, and it's hard to begrudge people who work at those, but it does create a very large bill, and it will no doubt, you know, as I read, it will suck workers from other parts of the sector into the economy into there, and that could have a knock-on effect on wages and so forth. So that can't be ignored in the context of this, but I guess it sort of dovetails neatly into the budget decision we're going to see on aged care costs.
Well, it underlines, doesn't it, the point that the costs of aged care are rising. This is no surprise. We've known this for a while, and this week we saw the task force report that the government put together of various industry players and others to look at how to fund this. Dan, it's, well, happily for the government, ruled out the idea of a Medicare-style levy for all taxpayers to fund aged care, and look, and the Minister, Annika Wells, certainly was ruling that out as well.
We can rule out a new levy, we can rule out a new tax, we can rule out any changes to the treatment of the family home. And we hope that being able to do that today, we can now work cooperatively with the opposition and try and land a response that everybody can support in the parliament.
Yeah, so we'll see what that response is, but it looks like more user pays, more means testing for those who can afford it.
Yeah, which was one of the key recommendations of this review this week, which seems to be in complete contrast to the Aged Care Royal Commission, which...
Well, it said a levy, didn't it?
Absolutely, and said that older Australians should not be required to contribute to their cost of care, and that it should be, nor should it be means tested. Instead, every Australian should contribute towards the financing of the aged care system through their working life, which it would be akin to superannuation, that it is something that builds up over time. But whether politically this would be something that gets supported.
Well, it would be a tax increase, essentially, whatever you want to call it.
Absolutely.
The way they're putting this in the task force report, Sam, is care is still provided, but it's all the living expenses that you're going to pay more for if you can afford it.
Yeah, and there's this argument that you should pay a greater proportion in terms of at-home care. So there's this great movement that a lot of people would like to stay at home, and there's also medical evidence that people with dementia, go downhill when you move them from their house, and so there's reasons to keep them in the home. But the percentage that is a co-contribution, if you like, for at-home care is much lower. Personally, I understand the efficacy of the idea of the simplicity of a levy, but one of the reasons why I think it is just not politically saleable is this generational, issue where you have a younger generation of Australians that are going to be paying more taxes because of the ageing population anyway, can't get into the housing market, huge HECS debts, and then if you're to hit them with a levy...
There was a member of the task force group here that I spoke to, Thomas Walker. He's an economist who was specifically brought on because he's a younger generation economist, bringing that sort of intergenerational view. He agrees the levy's a bad idea, unfairly hits the young, but they are leaving the family home pretty much untouched. And I asked him about that for our Insiders on Background podcast as well. Why do multi-million dollar homes not be subject to a more stringent assets test? Here he was. Was that something, though, that the minister said, this is a no-go area. We're not touching the family home. It's too politically tricky.
No, the minister was very open to everything. There was some very good conversations around a lot of really tricky political things, and I think we all felt empowered to have our say on issues like the family home.
But did everyone really think that was the best way to do it? Don't touch the family home?
Yeah, it was like the report is really long. The whole sector is really complex. We discussed many different things, and when it came to the family home, it was sort of ruled out pretty quickly.
You can listen to the podcast there, the QR codes, if you want to listen to it or watch it on ABC.
Doesn't seem to have a very good answer, David.
Well,
what
do you
did
think?
he say after
Well,
that?
it goes back, if you go back to the start of this, when Annika Wells launched this process in August last year, and Peter Dutton came out fairly quickly and said, we support this. You know, we're prepared to work with them on this because it's a massive problem. Like, aged care blew out to $30 billion last year, just for 1 year, and that's not counting the $14 billion for the pay rise, right? So both sides know that this is a problem. It's got to be addressed. And Dutton said, look, we'll back up it, so long as there's no new tax or nothing resembling a death tax. Now, you start changing the tax treatment of the family home and you bring that, and then you start opening that door. There's the next thing, you're using the family home to mean, as part of the assets.
So that's
for
why
the age pension.
That's why Labor's ruled this out.
Well, I think it was just deemed, like deemed thin edge of the wedge. So Albanese got asked him.
And the task force had to swallow that.
Well, in Parliament last year, are you planning to change the tax treatment of the family home? And he didn't rule out a couple of times, and then he did earlier this year. At the moment, only I think it's about $197,000 worth of your house contributes to the cost you pay in aged care now, unless you live in a tar paper shack out at Galagan Bay. Everyone's house is worth 200 grand at least. So it's an obsolete means test. Yeah, and there's an absolute argument to lift that threshold on what the house is worth. But
they're not touching it.
I think they'll pull their punches on budget day. I think you'll pay more if you've got more, and they also looked at setting up some sort of superannuation annuity, and the super fund said no, this is people's money in retirement. You can't prescribe how they use it, but nonetheless, I think if you're in a care facility or at home, and you've got super, you're going to have to use a bit more of it. And look, it happens that way now. I've had family experience with the aged care system, in recent years, and that's just how it works. If you've got a bit more, you can pay more and get a better deal. Get better food,
It's
hairdresser.
a choice issue rather than being forced to do.
Yeah, but now you're just going to, your daily care, I mean, at the moment, I think it's a $32,000 annual cap you pay and $76,000 lifetime cap.
That'll go up.
I totally accept that it's not politically feasible to start, going after people's homes. But I still think there's a lot of bunkum in this debate where people sort of basically suggest that, oh my goodness, that you can't ask these people to pay for their own care. Why?
Well,
we ask everyone else to.
They will.
Look, a final one. The post-voice pivot, if we can call it that, from the Prime Minister. He was in the Northern Territory for a few days this week with some big spending that he hopes will close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage. $4 billion for housing, remote housing, $1 billion for schools in the Northern Territory as well. Here he was.
We have said that we want to close the gap. What we've said is that we want to look at measures that will make a practical difference to people's lives. And there's nowhere that makes a bigger difference than in fixing up the housing issues that are here in the Northern Territory and in remote communities.
Dan, you've seen politicians talk about fixing up housing in remote communities in the Territory for many, many years. Is what we heard this week going to be a different approach? Is it going to do what the previous attempts have failed to do? Yeah, you're right. It's bookended a lot of my career. Where he was at Binjari near Katherine was where the former CLP Chief Minister Adam Giles made a similar announcement some years back. I think when we talk about housing in the Northern Territory, the complexities that go into it are so layered that there is the cost, where you're getting materials to. Galawinku, for example, is one of these very, very remote communities that's in the grip of this terrible weather right now. So there is the weather issue also. And in the past, it hasn't been a great story. When you had the CHIP, it was bedevilled with problems, particularly around bureaucracy. My understanding is over the last recent years, since 2016, the program that the Northern Territory government has rolled out has actually seen a substantial number of homes built, and it's also seeing refurbishments and work done and across the board kind of shift in the way housing is looked at. Now, what we saw this week was really an extension and collaboration
of that. So I think it's just over 2.2 billion from the federal government.
Just on the collaboration, because we heard around the Voice debate a clear desire from the government to work with Indigenous communities on how programs are delivered and funding is rolled out. Who's been involved in this process so far?
Yeah, so Aboriginal Housing NT, which is its own standalone organisation, and the land councils really crucially have had a seat at the table, as well as, of course, the different layers of government. And this is all because, as we saw in the Closing the Gap report a couple of weeks ago, things are not getting better across the board. In some instances, they're getting worse. The Productivity Commission report a couple of weeks before that said that the lack of power sharing is the key problem here, and it's why we're not seeing those changes and are not likely to see those changes. So this approach may be the game changer, which we'll have to wait and see. But I was, in preparing for today, I was looking back over some of my reporting out at Borroloola, where Malarndirri McCarthy, in fact, is from. And about 9 years ago, I was there speaking to Penelope, who was managing a 2-bedroom home. 26 people were living there, including 15 children. Now, that was breakdown across the board, including that she couldn't get cut through with the local housing organisations in her community.
Yeah, well, what do you think? Is this approach now squarely focused on we're going to close the gap with, you heard the Prime Minister use the word practical there. Is this going to be the approach from here?
Well, it's always been the approach, hasn't it? I mean, the Voice tried to do something different and sort of have more, engender more sort of specific advice, but this is sort of back to sort of just funding again, isn't it? So hopefully it works. I hope we don't return, as Marshall Langdon said, the annual misery fest of the Closing the Gap statement, where we just, make incremental at best progress. But
how poorly we're doing.
I think it's interesting too how much dough the PM spent in the NT last week. It wasn't just the $4 billion. He threw $800 million plus at a critical minerals mine, 10% of which is owned by Gina Reinhardt. So
a couple of interesting seats to watch.
Yeah, must be tied up there.
And also the Northern Territory election in August, where, and these are small electorates that we're talking about, like 5,000 enrolled voters for some. And the last 4 times I've been to Darwin, Katherine and Tennant Creek, where I'm from, the mood for change is on, like we saw in the lead up to 2001 and the lead up to 2016.
Our panel, Dan Borscher, Phil Curry and Samantha Maiden, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with Zoe Norton-Lodge, who's the executive producer for arts here at the ABC, and a very warm welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike.
Zoe, we're putting the AUKUS back in AUKUS this week, as the Pentagon's promises seem to be a little bit subpar.
Yes, indeed. They've got like one submarine behind their back and they're like, what submarine? What submarine?
Surely there's enough Virginia-class submarines to give us one?
I mean, you've got to I just assume they've got loads.
Yeah.
They're just hiding them.
Lovely David Pope, who's channeling cargo cults here, the last of the Pacific cargo cults. I do like Peter Dutton here as the fissile potato.
Yes, absolutely. He's just heard the word nuclear. He's like, I would like to join this line.
With the Frond submarine, and they're at the sitting here at the end of the runway looking skyward for the plane that never comes. In this case, it's the sub that never comes.
Yes, sad.
Zoe, the leader of the opposition, introduced his nuclear policy, and it's still a hot Dutton topic.
Yes, that's right.
Mark Knight has done Duttonheimer.
I've heard about this. This is actually like the sequel to Oppenheimer.
Right.
Yeah, and like Oppenheimer, there are a lot of nude scenes, so unfortunately, no one went to see it. It's just what I've heard.
Brett Lethbridge's Bask in the Glow.
So here he's got for Best Support Act for Nuclear Power.
Yeah.
I think he does kind of deserve an Academy Award for pretending this isn't about coal. It's a very good performance.
It's very good. Johannes Leek, no nukes, the Prime Minister here. Typical, it's just no to everything with this bloke. No to no nukes.
Why is Albo, naked? Can we just get all of them naked out of our heads?
Matt Golding, our biggest challenge is locating the reactors and nuclear dump sites in marginal seats.
Define marginal seats.
Anywhere where we put a reactor or nuclear dump site. That's the thing, isn't it?
If they rebranded the nuclear reactor as like a tanning salon, they could put it in Bondi.
Right, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
I think so.
You could
be a politician.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd be so bad at it.
Glenn Lelevre, he seems to have ditched the internal combustion engine here and replaced it with a twin reactor.
Yes, I know, and like they're really trying to help him, but I love how like calm and focused and happy Dutton looks here after his failed launch. Don't you think? It's like he's just like, look at his little face.
Yeah, well, they've just flipped the hood on him.
Yeah.
You know? The road assist guy just doesn't really know what to do here.
Yeah, no one really knows what to do. What were you thinking? What are you doing? Why are we doing this? We're all dying.
John Kudelka has hit on the fact that it's really not about nuclear reactors, I think he's trying to say to us here.
Yeah, a little bit of a hint there.
Yeah.
Well, how the hell's that going to work?
And they flip the top, they put down the ramp, and it's beep, beep, beep with the truck and dumping the coal in.
I really like how he's drawn the small modular reactor like a bin, which is where I think the idea should probably go.
Zoe, it seems the Great Barrier Reef is in a lot of hot water as it's going through another bleaching event. And Kathy Wilcox, where has all the colour gone?
I know.
NOAA and the Bureau of Meteorology are using them. It's just lovely David Pope, who's got John Howard, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. I get knocked down, but I get up again. The clownfish change, but the tune stays the same.
I think they're just kind of trying to bring the Barrier Reef in line with the history of Australian Prime Ministers.
Right.
They're all white.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Fiona Katauskas, the science is in Gary, I said. Just look around you, Gary, I said. But he's still a proud member of the Climate Skeptics Club.
Gary.
So that he's obviously cooked because he's orange, right?
I know. He's like the rest of us. We just do not realise we're already cooked.
You're already cooked.
Yeah.
What's your ocean warming is a hoax. We're not in hot water, even though you're cooked, Gary.
Gary, you look delicious, though. I will say that.
It's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week, Zoe.
Did we unpick them, though?
I don't think we did, really. We just mocked them mercilessly.
Yeah, we'll do that, won't we?
I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Stan.
David, last year there was a lot of discussion about racism at the ABC. The independent review into ABC systems and processes in support of staff who experience racism is underway. Independent, de-identified, going to be publicly released, led by Indigenous leader Dr Terry Janke. She's calling for people to contribute. You can do so on her website. This was called for by Indigenous staff, and the time has been taken to get the cultural protocols right. So this is a pretty big deal.
Okay, Phil.
Earlier this week, Peter Dutton and then John Howard and then Kim Beazley all came out in support of 4-year terms for federal parliament, and Peter Dutton went as far to say that if the Prime Minister was serious, he'd sit down and have a chat to him about it. Sceptical, clearly, about whether the public would support it and given referendums and so forth, but I think Howard made a good point that you would put a standalone question, no other question, on the ballot paper at a federal election, and then if it was accepted, they wouldn't start until the subsequent election, so you wouldn't have people being able to say either of the people going for that election were trying to get 4 years. So all power to their arm, I say, David.
Momentum.
Phil Corey's life work. So I just want to say congratulations to Penny Wong and her wife Sophie, who got married. A great big Labor wedding in Adelaide over the weekend, which the Prime Minister flew into, as I think he found some other things to do to justify the trip as well. But congratulations to them. I think it's fantastic. And not that long ago, this would have been some sort of big deal, and now we just think it's wonderful,
Now
like
it's
it
just a
is.
regular
So here we
wedding.
are.
Congratulations indeed from all of us to Penny Wong and Sophie. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Now, finally, this jibe from the Prime Minister came before Carlton's win over Richmond on Thursday night, but because we've got Blues tragic Phil Curry on the couch with us, we couldn't resist playing it anyway. We'll leave you with Anthony Albanese's dose of reality for some young Carlton fans in the Northern Territory. Thanks for watching.
What team do you go for?
The Adelaide Crows.
The Crows? How about you? Carlton?
Richmond. Carlton. Oh, no idea.
No idea.
Carlton.
Carlton are pretty bright because of the blue, maybe. Who do you go for?
Carlton.
Gee whiz, it's a Carlton phenomenon. Gee, lots of heartbreak ahead for you kids. Just saying.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.